Okay, so let's start with Kfir Bibas. He's not even 1 year old at the time of 7/10/23. He's just a baby. But for most of his life, he's been trapped in a tunnel, held by masked, armed terrorists. Think about that. Like a little baby, yeah, ripped from his home, surrounded by unimaginable terror. That's the reality of Hamas's actions. One that began on 7/10 and has continued until today. And is continuing. With the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. That's nearly 1,200 innocent lives snuffed out. Men, women, children, families, all slaughtered in cold blood. And more than 200 others, like little Kfir Bibas, were kidnapped and dragged into Gaza. It's evil, pure and unadulterated evil. So when it comes to 471 days later, where as a result of various different forces, 3 hostages are being amazingly released. Okay, and the price has been staggering for this. And I'm not getting into the merits or demerits of the deal. That's not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is to analyze the way that the narrative is portrayed by the mainstream media. But before we get into that, just to frame what we're talking about again, Israel has been fighting to ensure an atrocity like the 7th of October never happens again. And the price, let's be clear, the price has been absolutely staggering. 405 Israeli soldiers killed up until today. Please God, no more should lose their lives. Nearly 5,000 soldiers have been left with amputations, and thousands more have been gravely wounded. This was all started on 7/10. Israel was forced into this war. It didn't want, when 1,200 of its citizens were murdered in cold blood and 200 kidnapped. These soldiers are fighting to eliminate Hamas, the very force that caused this shocking nightmare. And let's be clear about Gaza. Most of the deaths there have been Hamas terrorists. The actual terrorist to civilian ratio is between 1:1 and 1:2. For comparison, other wars, for instance in Iraq and in Afghanistan, have been around 1:7, between 1:9 and 1:12 terrorist to civilian combat, civilian to terrorist ratios. It's a huge difference. And this is a much more complicated environment than Iraq or Afghanistan in the 2000s. This is an urban built-up area where Hamas hides among civilians, as we know. So don't let the media spin that there's been a genocide. When you see people coming out of Gaza all celebrating today, going back into Gaza, I should say, and they're all celebrating. They don't look particularly starved. The birth rate, the population of Gaza has actually increased despite the fact that there's been a war for 15 months. And they've been gaslighting the world to tell the world that there's been some kind of genocide, and they bring these show trials in the ICC, and it's just been a complete disgrace how Israel has been the Jew among the nations, has been persecuted by the media and by the way that these narratives are framed. Has Israel done everything perfectly? Has it done nothing wrong in this war? I'm sure there are things that if you scratch hard you can find, but who is in the right in this and who is in the wrong, it's very, very clear. Israel didn't want this war, it didn't ask for this war, but it had no choice but to go into this war, to get its people back. So here we are, with all of these deaths, amputations, grave injuries, and that's on the Israeli side. We know about how Gaza itself has suffered as a result of Hamas's actions. Huge devastation to the infrastructure, buildings. You know, it's a shame when you see things like that, but they were terrorist homes. There were terrorist infrastructures in there. Weapons, that's what they've been doing. That's where they've been taking your aid money and building that. Okay, so let's just frame exactly what's going on here nice and clearly. So there isn't a genocide here. 1-to-1, 1-to-2 terrorist to civilian ratio, civilian to terrorist ratio, terrorist to civilian ratio rather, is not a genocide. And if Israel had wanted to do a genocide and had flagrant disregard to its people, then it could have done so on the first few days after the 7th of October. But the fact that it's risked its own soldiers to go in and do a complicated ground operation, as well as the bombing, that has resulted in a large number of deaths and injuries, should show you that that hasn't been happening. Together with the birth rate, together with the population increasing in Gaza, and the fact that they claim victory. So, I mean, if you've been subject to a genocide, then how do your people come out looking pretty well fed? Your population has increased and you're celebrating that you won. It doesn't add up. So if you haven't really clocked by now that you've been gaslit by the way that these enemies of civilization are framing things, then you should probably go and do something about that. So now, after all of this has happened, after we've had 15 months of Israel being drawn into this fighting, we've got over the next 42 days, 33 hostages are going to be released in exchange for nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. Many of these guys are hardened terrorists. These guys have blood on their hands, serious blood on their hands. These are the shooters in Yosh, in Judea and Samaria. These are the stabbers. One of them is the person who killed the animal that killed Ari Ford, stabbed him in the neck, and Ari Ford still fought back to fight him and eventually wound him severely. And he's one of these prisoners being released. The murderer of the Fogel family. This is back in this was around 2011, 2010, 2011. The Fogel family. Someone went into the home of the Fogels and murdered the entire family. Look it up. It's heinous, this crime. Awful. Blood everywhere. Cold blood. And the guy who was responsible for that, the animal who was responsible for that, is being released as part of this deal. So the price Israel is paying to get its people back is very, very high. Is a very steep price. So no country should ever have to take this kind of decision. But yet, I'm not going to profess to know or get into the political or the moral question in this video. That's for another time. All I wanted to do in this video is discuss the way the media is presenting things. So we're going to have a look at this now on Sky News. And I want you to just be conscious as we watch this together of how the media are spinning this is some kind of equivalence between the hostages being released and, on the other hand, lahavdil elef avdalot. On the other hand, the evil murderous terrorists. The evil murderous terrorists who killed Ari Ford are not the same as 1-year-old Kfir Bibas. Like, that should be obvious. So let's start the video.
Mixed reports about that, but really the first step is for the hostages to be taken into the care of the Red Cross before they are then brought across the border.
Well, Amy Shalan, obviously at the same time, Palestinian prisoners will also be freed from Israeli detention, mainly women and children, we understand. Are you grateful that they are released? Because on the list in the first phase, some 735 prisoners in this first phase, of which 328 we understand. In fact, just looking at pictures of a helicopter taking off, it would appear. Yes, apologies, Amy, we're trying to react to these pictures. Yes, so a Palestinian prisoner release at the same time.
So you can see here how she's framing this. She's brought on a guest, and she's going to give this guest a good few minutes of airtime, and you're going to listen to what this guest has to say, okay? But you can see how she's already starting to frame this. She says, The hostages are being released, and the Palestinian prisoners are being released. As if, like, the way that this should be presented is how Israel has been cornered into this kind of deal, and how, in order just to get its people back, it's having to make ridiculous concessions of these hardened criminal terrorists. But you'll hear the way that they're described. They're not described in any kind of way, in any kind of accurate description. So let's listen to what this lady, who's the head of, I believe, the Palestinian Committee Chair of London. So we'll hear what she has to say.
Yes, well, of course, it is relief to have prisoners released. There have been mass arrests of Palestinians throughout the months. As we know, there are many people don't know where they are. There are doctors, there are nurses, as you said, that there are children who have been held by Israel in Israeli prisons, and they've been arrested. I mean, there have been mass arrest campaigns by Israel way before this was happening. There were already many thousands of detainees in Israeli prisons historically over time. The question is what those Palestinians are returning to also. I mean, do they have homes to go to? Are there homes there? Are there families there? How many of them have lost their family members? I think you've been talking with a great deal of passion about the individual stories of the Israeli hostages, but Palestinians tend to be counted in numbers rather than as individuals who have been undergoing lifelong occupation and apartheid regime. And what we now need is a fundamental change in approach from the UK government and from the international community. We've seen absolute support for Israel's actions in Gaza, and while dismissing the rights of Palestinians under international law. And it's really imperative that we now see our elected representatives take decisive action that really holds Israel accountable and ends the UK's complicity in Israel's violations of international law. And that includes collective punishment via imprisonment. And a fundamental change in approach is really essential if this ceasefire is to be more than a brief pause in an ongoing war against the Palestinian people. For decades, the dominant political discourse in the global north has really situated Palestine within a conflict paradigm that fails to take into account the key historical facts and root causes. And as a result, Israel's been able to continue to colonize Palestinian land, to become more explicit about its expansionist goals, while the rhetoric of supposed peace really is requiring the oppressed to come to the table to be further oppressed. And that's been really deeply entrenched. So that we have a mindset now that makes occupation and apartheid and settler colonialism, even genocide, seem normal, instead of supporting Palestinians to end the horrifically abnormal conditions that they are living under and the structures of oppression that they face.
So, you can hear in that how she's been given, we listened to her together there. You can see how this lady's been given airtime. Like, the only people that should be given airtime right now are the hostage families and government ministers and people reacting to the amazing news that 3 innocent people have coming back, to their families after 15 months apart. Yet Sky News have dedicated a segment of this this release of the hostages to basically give a soapbox to someone who is an apologist for terrorism. She has mentioned, all of the buzzwords there. She's mentioned genocide, she's mentioned occupation, she's mentioned settler, she's mentioned colonialism, she's mentioned systemic, I think she said systemic structural problems, and how just framing these vile vermin terrorists as somehow the sad, pathetic, poor victims in all of this. And She wasn't challenged by the presenter at all. She wasn't challenged on any of that. And in fact, it's going to get worse, because you're going to listen to how the presenter on the ground actually responds to how to her comments there.
Amy Shalland, Chair of the British Palestinian Committee, thank you very much indeed. And Amy, lamenting the fact that Palestinian prisoners are dealt with as just numbers. Part of the problem has been that nobody knows exactly how many people have been taken from Gaza. We spoke to the Palestinian Prisoners Society yesterday, and they don't know if it's hundreds or thousands of people who've been taken from the Gaza Strip. Some of them, we've seen pictures, they're nearly naked, sat, they're taken away. What we do know is that part of phase one, our understanding is that 1,067 Palestinians who've been taken from Gaza will be freed as part of phase one. As I said, nobody knows their names, so it's hard for us to identify and individualize them, as their names have not been released. Let me return.
Wow. So this woman on the ground here, she's actually in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, surrounded by the families and the friends of those who are awaiting the arrival of the hostages back into Israel. And what does she say? So she talks about that we don't know how many people have been taken. Like, in other words, no. When people were taken, that happened on the 7th of October 2023. That's when people were taken out of their beds, out of their homes, with their families, taken on trucks, away, innocent, for 15 months, in tunnels. That was when people were taken. But this woman on the screen has decided to frame the taking, as she's, in her words, the arrest of terrorists, wanted terrorists with blood on their hands, who have been put into Israeli prisons, pending hearings and pending trials. Okay, but she's described them as people taken. Not only that, she's acting like, these poor people, we don't even know how many of them there are. There could be hundreds, there could be thousands, we just don't know. They're just not, and going back to what the woman said before from the Palestinian Chair Committee in London, she was saying, we just don't know what's happened to them. And I think it was before, but it may be later, where she says that, they've been reduced just to numbers. I believe it was the lady before. She said they're just like numbers. Like, we don't even know. They're hundreds, it could be thousands. It's so bad we don't even know, who these people are. As if there's some kind of humanitarian tragedy that's happened to these like, she's not calling them hostages, but it's as if she's framing these terrorists, these cold-blooded terrorists, murderers, the kinds of people who have done 9/11 and 7/7 and who would have ended up in Guantanamo Bay in America, actual hardened terrorists. She's acting like they've just been abducted by Israel, and we just don't know their fate, and we just don't know. We can only pray for them. Look at her face as well. She's so sad. She's so depressed about this, about what they've gone through. These poor terrorists who have been, who Israel have taken. She talks about how they were nearly naked, and that they were taken away, 1,067 taken, and we don't know their names. And what is she talking about? Let's continue.
I'm rather unwell, so it just goes to show the unpredictability of what faces the hostages coming out of Gaza. But, we have to always keep reminding this, the many Palestinian prisoners who are being released as well. Many of those who have been kept in closed conditions, without charge, and for an indeterminate amount of time. I've been... So
now, again, we're so concerned about these terrorists who were caught either on the battlefield or where there was intelligence as to their terrorist activities. So this man who's now coming in and joining this this commentary or this analysis, if you want to call it that, you know, he's getting involved and he's saying, yeah, you know, they've just been held without trial. We just don't know, poor things, you know, these poor terrorists. You know, we really have to look out for them. We just don't know what's happening with them.
And the tunnels in Gaza have been the cages where the Israeli military.
And now this is a really interesting bit, because I think he gets confused because he starts moving from the, you know, how he sees the conditions of these wanted terrorists who are being held in Israeli prisons, to then talking about the conditions. He like segues into talking about the conditions that the Israeli actual hostages who have been sitting in tunnels for 15 months, how they were kept in cages, and how he's seen these cages, and how you'll see what he says in a second. He says that Israel has said that the DNA definitely matches the Israelis, as if he has some kind of idea in his head that maybe it's not. It's incredible how he's framing this, how they all are. The first lady that came on, the presenter on the ground, and the male presenter who's now getting involved as well.
Were convinced that hostages, they had DNA showing that hostages had been held in these cages. They are cramped, they are hot, there's very, very little air. Yes, you can see no daylight whatsoever. You can hear bombardment above you. You know that you're in something of a war zone, but you have very little realization of the outside world. And some of the hostages would have been kept underground, some will have been kept above ground, some will have been moved around a lot as the war has progressed, and Hamas and other groups will have had to have moved them to different places within Gaza as the Israeli military systematically has taken control of parts of Gaza.
Yes, indeed. We know 1.9 million Palestinians have been displaced. Those hostages will also have been displaced as they've been moved down towards the Rafah area, no doubt, towards Khan Younis.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to the hostages. Exactly, yeah. They've been displaced. Good word.
As well. If you're just joining us here on Sky News, let us recap what has been certainly an eventful day. And after 15 months of war, a nearly 3-hour-long delay here this morning, a long-awaited ceasefire is now underway in Gaza, coming into effect at 11:15 local time, 9:15 in the UK, after Israel finally received the names of 3 hostages due to be released any moment now. Well, 33 hostages.
So here we are. So just want to clarify before I conclude that while I've only included the bits here, and there was a section in between this of about 7-8 minutes where they were looking at the hostages and the families and talking about them, which was great. The fact that I wanted to focus on here was the fact that they even mentioned the well-being and the kind of sad stories of these terrorists. Yeah, like, yes, they were naked, almost naked, because they have to be searched for weapons of destruction and knives and guns. This is a war, and to in any way equivalate that with Kfir Bibas is mind-bogglingly evil. It's actually evil to not call something that's evil, and to call something that's innocent and true and good, and to mix the two is evil. So we've had hostages like Kfir Bibas in Hamas tunnels, 405 brave Israeli soldiers lost, and thousands more wounded in this fight to ensure that something as horrific as 7th of October can never happen again. Meanwhile, international media outlets like Sky News in London and the BBC twist the truth, and they paint a grotesque picture where terrorists are somehow the victims, and Israel, who are the actual victims of unprovoked barbarism, are somehow cast as a villain. And this isn't just a war over land or politics, it's the war of narratives. It's a war for the truth, and the truth actually matters, because when we let lies and distortions like this take root, we lose our ability to stand up for what's right. So with the media peddling these twisted stories, here's a message: we see through you. To those watching, share this, talk about this. Challenge the false narratives wherever you see them, because the world needs to know the truth, not just about what happened on 7th of October, but about the sacrifices being made every single day to ensure that that never happens again. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget, the fight for truth is a fight we cannot afford to lose, for the good of Israel, for the good of the Jewish people, for the good of the whole world and Western democracy. We need that. We need Israel to win, because if Israel doesn't, God forbid, then this is coming to a shore near you, if it hasn't already.